Okay, so the 1920s were a time of paradox. It's a time of reaction and progress. This will be the first of two videos on the 1920s. Now, immigration restriction continued during this time. We discussed Chinese and Japanese exclusion, and briefly the 1918 Immigration Act. The 1924 National Origins Act took things to a different level. It changed the type of immigrant that was allowed in the country. Now, when thinking about this, you may want to remember our discussion of nativism and the tiers associated with white superiority. This act, the Origins Act of 24, established quotas for each racial and national subgroup, thereby limiting the number of immigrants allowed in the country. 164,000 Europeans were allowed, for example. Significantly, these levels were established according to the 1890 census, and quotas were based on percentages of group members from that date. Now, why is this important? Because 1890 is before the major wave of immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, when most immigrant groups were from North and Western Europe prior to this time. Now, this law would remain on the books until the 1960s. Unfortunately, one of the negatives associated with it, it prevented refugees from Nazism during the 1930s, and this is something that would haunt many Americans ever since. But again, consider this. These quotas are based on a time when most immigrants were from Western and Northern Europe. So again, getting that what is considered the ideal white race, those from Northern and Western Europe, those from Protestant nations. So those who are from Catholic nations or Jews from Eastern and Southern Europe, they are minimized with this act. So it really creates even more of a divide, a racial and ethnic divide in the nation. Now, continuing reaction, not just with immigration officially with the government, but we also see the resurgence of the KKK. Now, we discussed this new type of immigrant. We discussed nativism and its focus on the WASP, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. This, too, was the focus of this re-energized KKK. Now, race was obviously still of primary concern, but also important was intimidation of Catholics, Jews, and other Orthodox groups, as well as immigrants in general. The P, again, from WASP, the P stands for Protestant, and that was the ideal. William J. Simmons revived the Ku Klux Klan in 1915 Georgia, and this was partially inspired by D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. Now, recently there was another Birth of a Nation movie that came out about Nat Turner, and I'm sure it's fine and all, but Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith version, is a classic. It is racist, it is awful, it is disturbing, but it is a film masterpiece, and it is worth watching if you get a chance. It's a silent movie, but again, it's very disturbing. It's very intense, but it really gives you an idea of what many white Southerners felt after the Civil War. Now, the KKK claimed to support traditional values, and it did support prohibition and immigration restriction, two major issues of progressives, really. It was against women's suffrage and the increasing participation of women in public affairs. It boycotted and vandalized Jewish, Black, and Catholic businesses. By 1925, it had over 5 million members, but would begin its rapid decline thereafter. Immigration restriction was tackled by Congress, which neutralized one of their main issues. Growing economic prosperity also impacted them, as such unrest generally strengthens during times of trouble. One issue, though, the Grand Dragon of the local clan of Indiana, David Stevenson, kidnapped and raped a secretary employed at the state legislature. She told the authorities what happened and killed herself. Stevenson was charged with second-degree murder and expected the governor, who was also a Klan member, to pardon him. When he was not pardoned, he spilled his guts to the press, revealing many Klan secrets and telling the truth about just how violent the Klan was and how it operated. Members left en masse after this, and the KKK would never be the same. Now, even these 5 million members, compared to the rest of the American population, it is still a small number, but it was growing at this time. Again, this was a time of change. This was a time of unrest. This was a time when many people really did not know which way to go. We had the Red Scare of 1919, which I know was covered in the book. But this is a time when there is a lot of unrest, and that is one of the reasons the KKK rises at this time, why numbers increase. But again, once the truth comes out, the numbers dwindle quite a bit. Now, there's another example of this reaction, especially against immigrants, and that would be the Sacco and Vanzetti case. This provided, again, another example of the general disdain for immigrants and radicals in particular. 2 employees at a shoe warehouse in Massachusetts were murdered during a robbery in April of 1921. 2 Italian immigrants, Niccolo Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were arrested for the crime. They maintained their innocence, but there were problems. First, they were immigrants. Second, they were draft resistors. Third, they were anarchists. Fourth, they were socialists. Now, socialism and anarchism don't really seem to go together, but they were both. The evidence against the two was questionable at best. Eyewitnesses stated that two men committed the crime, then escaped in a car containing 2 or 3 other men. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested weeks later on a trolley car. Now, both were armed, and Sacco had a flyer announcing Vanzetti would speak at an upcoming anarchist rally. None of the money was ever recovered or linked to them. The trial judge allowed the prosecution to present evidence of their anarchist ideology, their immigrant background, and their refusal to register for the military draft. All of these things were irrelevant, of course, but that was actually what was relevant to many people at the time. Now, with regard to appeals, the trial judge was the only one who could allow a retrial and denied all requests. Furthermore, appellate rules at the time denied the Supreme Court a chance to review the case, thus sealing their fate. 2 weeks after their arrest, they were found guilty. Many protested the verdict, and it became a cause célèbre in many ways, as celebrities and some officials claimed they were only convicted because they were radical immigrants. One of their supporters was future Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who wrote passionately in defense of them. Indeed, 4 years after the fact, a man admitted to the crime, saying he had committed it along with a local gang. The two were never granted a retrial, though, and were sentenced to death on April 9, 1927, 6 years after the crime and 2 years after another man had admitted to it. They were executed a scant 4 months later on August 23, 1927. Now, were they innocent or guilty? After all, some do admit to crimes they did not commit for various and strange reasons. Regardless, though, the trial itself was biased against them, and it was further proof, really, that immigrants had very little chance, especially in court. So now in the past we've discussed the attempts at Americanization by the progressives. I talked about that last week, and there is no larger example of the attempts at Americanization by progressives than Prohibition. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was passed. It banned the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol beverages. But what did it not outlaw? Drinking it. So you couldn't manufacture it, you couldn't sell it, you couldn't transport it, but by golly, you could drink it. Protestants and progressives have a few goals. First of all, they want to improve worker productivity. They also believe that families would grow closer as alcoholic husbands would no longer come home and abuse verbally or physically the rest of the family. And there's a belief that urban slums will disappear because alcohol is gone. Now, did any of this happen? No. Now, there were some successes. Alcohol consumption did go down. It went down to 1/3 of its pre-World War I level. There was a decrease in alcohol-related disease, obviously. Family savings did increase, though did this have to do with Prohibition or the fact that the economy was growing and people were making more money? One could never be sure about that. But these were changes that came at the time and after the amendment was passed. Now, Prohibition was doomed by problems of application. First of all, there were not enough funds to thoroughly enforce the measure. Second, alcohol possession was permitted for medical purposes, so production of small amounts in the home was allowed. Near beer was permitted. This had no alcohol, but breweries had to make the real beer first before extracting the alcohol to make the near beer. Thus, if a brewery was found with real beer, it could simply justify it by saying they had not yet extracted the alcohol. And because it was illegal, alcohol was now stronger. One wanted to drink a small amount and drink it quickly to avoid detection. Now, because it was illegal, there were no regulations. How's that for irony? It was less safe. For example, black market alcohol often caused nerve damage, blindness, or even death. And there are plenty of examples of people dying from drinking what ended up being essentially poison. But it was masqueraded as alcohol. This is also where we see the introduction of, ta-da, the cocktail. The harsh liquor that was sold at the speakeasies was often difficult to drink, and people didn't want to try to taste it. So bartenders, being innovative, as they always are, began using fruit juice and other additives to make it more palatable. And so that, again, is where we get the mixed drinks. That's where we get the cocktails. They all originate from this time when alcohol was so awful that nobody wanted to drink it straight. But what was the biggest negative of Prohibition? Organized crime. Al Capone, for example, established his gangs and gang warfare in Chicago as bootleggers control who buys what. They charge for protection and make sure alcohol is flowing freely and fully throughout the cities. Police even bought this alcohol and took cash from mobsters. Corruption existed, as it always had, regardless of the progressives' attempts. Now, in 1933, the 21st Amendment would repeal the 18th. This was an attempt at social engineering. And in this attempt at social engineering, the attempt to restrict individual rights and civil liberties definitely backfired. Not only did it not solve the problems they hoped it would, it also led to the establishment of a new form of crime that would inhabit the big cities for decades to come. Now, we talked about reaction, but let's talk about progress. Not everything was paranoia and reaction. Not everything was negative. In fact, the 1920s brought about many important changes. These are associated with technology. First and foremost, arguably the most important, the automobile. This facilitated transportation for individuals, for families, for large groups, in buses. It facilitated the transportation of goods as well. Henry Ford revolutionized the automobile industry in many ways. He introduced the assembly line, which made the process more efficacious. He instituted the $5 day for workers, when most industrial workers made no more than $2 a day. His hope was to increase productivity, but also that his workers could afford to buy their product. Now think about that. I mean, today we think $5 a day, oh my gosh, that's awful. But it was over 2 times what most industrial workers made at the time. Now that is a significant difference. And again, you can see why somebody would want to go work for Henry Ford. He offered good money. Now, Ford's goal was to make the same simple car as cheaply as possible. There were no options as we understand them today. He even joked when he was faced with a competitor's claim that he had more options than Ford. Ford said that the buyer could have the Model T in any color as long as it was black. In 1914, the Model T cost $490, a quarter of what it had been 10 years previous. So this shows the importance of the assembly line, of many of these innovations that came about. And this is what we see with goods even through today. Anything comes out, it's very expensive at first. As it becomes easier and cheaper to make, and as the demand kind of subsides a little bit, the price goes down. So again, in 1914, we see the Model T costing a quarter of what it had in 1904. In 1920, 8 million Model Ts were registered. By 1930, 24 million were registered. Now, Ford's methods made the automobile more affordable. This broadened who could buy and use it, thus making it increasingly a common part of one's everyday life. Ford may have paid his workers well, but he did not necessarily treat them well. He spied on them. He maintained a gang of thugs to beat up any troublemakers or union organizers. He was also a bigot who published vicious tracts against African Americans and Jews, who he blamed for destroying American society and corrupting its youth. One of his competitors was Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors, GM, who made some of his own revolutionary changes. He offered different models and different colors of cars, thus Ford's reply earlier. Significantly, he introduced the idea of the annual model change to encourage people to buy cars before they had even worn out. Thus, others could tell how old your car was just by looking at it, and GM's marketing department worked to make sure that driving an old car became a badge of shame. Ford responded too slowly and would fall behind GM and later Chrysler. Now, a few things that we see with this, again, this idea of class status and shame. If you have the older car, you're just not as good as the people who have the newer one. We also see an idea called programmed obsolescence, where you create something with the intent of making it obsolete within a few years. And this was Sloan's plan, and this has been true in the American auto industry really ever since. I mean, that's something that kind of Sloan helped devise, and we see that, again, consider if automakers made a car that lasted forever, you'd never buy another one. So, of course, they have to work with this programmed obsolescence. Anyway, let's get away from economics for a minute. So we're talking about the automobile, and importantly, their spin-off industries would also prosper from the rise of the automobile. Now, this is something many call the invisible hand of capitalism, and it helps to show that capitalism, while it does lead to some inequity as far as salary, as far as wealth, it does also spread this prosperity and spread this efficiency so that there are not just the one industry that profits, but there are many. Now, some of these spin-off industries, vulcanized rubber, road construction, highway design, gas stations would multiply. There is a need for mechanics. There's a need for oil, steel, motels, diners. So there are all these jobs and all this economic impact just from the automobile. These are all necessary for the car itself, thus funneling more money into the economy and leading to more jobs. Now, some are offshoots of this new mobility that individuals and families enjoy. For example, they would take cars for long rides on a weekend day or taking it on vacation, thus necessitating new motels and diners along the highways. So you can see the larger impact. But this also plays a role in the creation of the suburb. Now, in the 1920s, the suburbs became an increasingly popular place to live, as people can now drive into work rather than have to live close enough to walk or take streetcars. Also important to recognize, if somewhat unfortunate, is that the rush to urbanization led many working-class individuals and families to live in the cities, leading to some crowding and overcrowding. Thus, those who could afford it did not want to be stuck in these crowded situations. They wanted space, and for some, a return to nature. And the suburbs offered breathing room for these people. Now, these suburbs were initially about residential areas, not so much about business. Cars could take people into the city or other areas for their shopping needs. The country club would also become an important symbol during this time, as these would crop up in middle-class suburbs and provide a central location for leisure among the well-to-do. We will discuss the suburbs more thoroughly in a few weeks when we discuss the 1950s, but this is when we begin to see the growth of suburban life. So, one thing, again, to consider here, I talk about how urbanization led to crowding and overcrowding, and people didn't want to live in the cities. This is not an American phenomenon. Really, throughout the previous centuries in Europe, people who lived in the city were generally associated with filth, with sin, things like that. So the ideal was to live in the countryside. Now, when you have mass immigration, you have mass industrialization, that leads to urbanization. This is something we've talked about this term. So people had to move to the cities for jobs, etc. So when people moved out of the cities, again, it is a return to this belief that urban areas are about filth, they're about crime, they're about sin. So again, this kind of continues a Western ideal that has existed for many, many centuries. A lot of people talk about white flight, and it's true. And it's not a positive, but it is also part of a much larger historical trajectory. It's not just about racist whites in America, for example. But again, it is a negative. So, after getting through all that, the automobile was about freedom for many. And we're going to talk about that and some of the changes in culture here in the next video.